Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name's Matt Bailey. I'm the National Ambassador for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society here in Australia, in Sydney, and it's an afternoon live stream, which is a little bit unusual for us, but we've got a very special guest joining us this afternoon for a very special interview, a very special chat with someone who I have a lot of respect for in the whisky industry and someone who I've only ever had the chance to meet actually virtually. So this is kind of exciting that we're meeting virtually again. So I'd like to formally introduce Brendan McCarron from Glenmorangie Group. Brendan, thank you so much for joining us this Thursday afternoon, very early Thursday morning for you.
Yeah, I was going to say this morning. Doesn't feel like afternoon here.
It's 4 p.m. here.
Coffee.
Yeah, you're on coffee. I've just lined up my drams ready to go for when the time comes.
Yeah, so, you know, I would have the drams in front of me if we were going to talk about ones, but today I'm driving, so I'm driving a little later on, so it's going to be. But it's a Glenmorangie giraffe coffee cup. It's on brand. It's on brand if I can find the gram.
Yeah, wow. That's very cool. That is very cool. Thank you so much for joining us this morning in your time. It's bloody early where you are, I believe. It's 7 a.m. or something, isn't it?
Yeah, it's 7 a.m. and to be honest with you, I've got a 3-year-old kid, so I've got a little 3, and also normally I would commute about 1 hour to the office. So normally this would be fine, but we're in lockdown, and so with no commute, most of my working is from home.
Yep.
7 a.m. these days feels like 3 a.m. You know, it's my whole sleep patterns have shifted. I've turned into like a nocturnal creature. You know.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's dig into that a little bit actually, because I first of all want to introduce who you are and what you do. I mean, what your role entails for those watching along at home.
Sure.
Especially for our Victorian members, a big shout out to them. Always like to do a shout out for our Victorian members every single day at the moment, as they're very much in lockdown. But I just want to say, first comment coming in from Rob Akers there is 7 a.m. harsh man, appreciated.
Cheers, Robert.
It's from Jim Finnegan, good to see you. And Darren says, how do you Matt and morning, Brendan? That's the way. First of all, your role is head of maturing whisky stocks at Glenmorangie Group. And Glenmorangie Group includes obviously Glenmorangie, but also Ardbeg. So, and first of all, I mean, I'd love to hear, first of all, what that role entails, and then maybe a little bit about how you do that role in lockdown, when a lot of it must be sort of sampling casks and blending and assessing new make and whatnot. So we'll dig into those topics, but what does your role sort of entail in that regard?
Yeah, so my role is pretty broad, I would say. So I guess, let's see, what are my main responsibilities? So I'm a senior member of our sensory panel, so I nose and taste all of our new make spirit from both Glenmorangie and Ardbeg. I nose and taste all of our mature spirit, so every expression of Glenmorangie that you see, the original Quinta, Nectar, La Santa, our 18-year-old, whenever we put a batch together, I'm one of the people who has to nose and taste and grade it, you know, and make sure it's okay. I basically work for Dr. Bill Lumsden. So Dr. Bill, a very famous person in the single malt whiskey world. He's our, I guess you could say he's our master blender and our master distiller kind of rolled into one, you know. So we call it whiskey creator. So he's the director of whiskey creation. And Bill hired me 6 years ago as his eventual successor, you know, so nothing is guaranteed, but that was the purpose of me being hired. I think Bill sort of looked around and said, if I get hit with a bus tomorrow, who takes over? And he wasn't really sure, so they sort of did this big hunt, and they interviewed a whole load of people, and I got the job, so lucky me.
And you were coming off a career at Diageo at the time.
Yeah. So I spent 8 great years working at Diageo, mostly on the kind of operational side of things. So I've been a maltster, so turning barley into malted barley. That was my first job. I'm a chemical engineer, so I did chemical engineering at university. So I worked on the design and build of Rose Isle, which was the first distillery built in Scotland in 40 years. After that, I did a year in America because I wanted to live in America, frankly, but it was also amazing. And became the manager of Oban. So I was the distillery manager at Oban, quite a long time ago now, which is scary. 2009. I was there for 2 years, and then after Oban, I moved to Islay, and I ran the Islay group for Diageo, which was Port Ellen, Lagavulin, Killala, and the engineering centre. And then after that time, mostly as like a production, making malted barley or blending whiskey, which I did at Leven, or running distilleries. I then kind of took this job, which really goes all the way from, see, I'm terrible in Zoom. I can never find the camera. And
no, I'm the same. Don't worry. I'm the same. Don't worry.
So I'm doing all these things with my hands and no one can see them. You know, I need like a fisheye lens.
I'd be pointing this way and going, and here's Brendan, and I'm pointing in the wrong direction. Oh, okay.
The other one I do as well is I tend to sit and I'm like, you try and get it and you go the wrong way. So you just start looking like a serial killer or something. But yeah. So the great thing about this job is, so I buy the casks, I buy the barley, I buy the yeast. I work with both distillery managers. I nose, I taste. Not as sexy a part of the job, but really important is working out how to fill our warehouses efficiently, but then also calculating, do we have enough stock? Wants to launch a 25-year-old, that's great. But if we launch a 25-year-old and we say it's permanent, then it better be permanently available and consistent. So doing that mathematical modelling, I get to do that with 2 other people as well. So basically I get to work on absolutely everything to do with making the whiskey up to handing over to the bottling hall. Then I'm not involved in that. And then the really cool part at the other side, it's a very small part of my job, but funnily enough, it's the one that people assume I do all the time, is sometimes I get to travel around the world and talk about the whiskies that either I've made myself or I've helped to make, under Dr. Bill's supervision.
Not so much this year, obviously, for obvious reasons, but I mean, that's an interesting aspect you raise at the end there about the whole sort of your role is both on the chemical side of things in selection and process and production, but also I've seen you in your capacity also as an ambassador.
Yeah,
and that's a rare correlation. You don't often see, especially you don't often see sort of distillers or people involved in the production side on the ambassadorial side, or I guess marketing or ambassadorial side of the spirit, which is obviously to talk about it because you've made it.
I got to do so I got to be in Australia maybe 6 times now since I've been with the company, so that's once a year. But last year, so I can't remember exactly when, but it was last year, we did this thing called the Signet pop-up, and we did it in Melbourne. So hello to everyone in Melbourne. I love Sydney, but Melbourne, I have like a real thing about. It blew me away. But we did this Signet pop-up. It was down on, because Melbourne's basically these 3 long streets, Flinders, and Flinders, or something like that. But it was, I know it like the back of my hand. Where did that come from? But it was down at the casino side, so casino side of Melbourne. Stick with me here, people. Honestly, I'll get this story out of my mouth. But we did a Signet pop-up.
South Lake, sure.
Somewhere like that. But I like talking, and it's so easy to talk about our whiskies, because how can you not be passionate about something like Signet? And it's so exciting and so amazing. But this rumour started up from people who were going to it. They were saying the Signet pop-up that's been arranged by Moët Hennessy Australia is amazing. The whiskey's incredible. What's the name of the company? One of the places that was making the cocktails, was this famous place was making the cocktails. They're like, the cocktails are incredible. The food from, is it Dumont, something like that?
Oh, right, sure.
Yeah, they're like, the food's incredible, and they're like, the only thing that's not so good about it is the really shitty Scottish accent that the actor's putting on. And I was like, that's me. That's me.
That's too good.
They just assumed, because I had to do a couple of bits and I had to say some lines and I had to talk, they just assumed I was like this Australian actor who'd been hired, and he's like, he's a nice guy, but his accent's terrible. And I was like, that's not a shitty fake accent. I was like, that's a shitty real accent.
You reminded me of an American whiskey tasting I went to in Australia. I won't say which brand, but they hired some Australian actors to put on these thick American accents to really tell the American story of the bourbons and the ryes. And at the end of it, we all thought, the spirit was great, but I don't know about that acting. And so
No,
But
no.
This is actually real in your case, but yeah.
Oh yeah. I took it as a compliment. I was obviously doing a good job, so they assumed I was an actor. But it kind of is. It's a tiny bit of the job. Is you have to be able to communicate about our whiskies, because making incredible whiskey that we believe tastes better than the competition, and the competition's great. That's important, but it's not enough. There's so much whiskey out there. I mean, there's so much single malt in Scotland, but there's so much other whiskey out there as well, and it's confusing and it's complicated, and if you're not careful, it can be intimidating. So it's all part of the role, but it's actually really important. So that was a big thing that Dr. Bill saw in me when he interviewed me. So first of all, do you have the technical background? There was a sensorial test. There was a whole test. Can you detect? Can you write tasting notes? Can you pick up flaws? Which I did. But then another part of it is, can you bring to life what Glenmorangie and Ardbeg are to people all over the world?
Yeah.
And so far, so good. So
just going back to an earlier part of your career, you mentioned Rose Isle before, and how your involvement, and it was the first new distillery in 40 years, as you said. Now, if you think about that for a second in context, compared to, say, the last 20 years in Scotland of what's been happening, where there's distilleries popping up left, right, and centre, and that's not just exclusive to Scotland, of course. That's across the world. We're seeing this explosion of distilleries. But what do you think the challenges are there in Scotch whiskey in general for all these new ones popping up? And I can't even keep track of all the new ones, to be honest. I hear all the names and I say, oh, there's this distillery and there's this little one and this mid-sized one, and it's how would you keep track of that? And what do you think the challenges are there for for the whole Scotch whiskey industry?
Yeah, so first of all, I love the question. So not to be a sook, not to ass kiss here, but I love that question, and you're probably the first person that's asked me it, and it is quite scary to think. 2006, I was at Diageo, and so I worked on the design of Rose Isle, and it was all hush hush and secret. It was the first distillery in 40 years. So right now we're really spoiled, all of us. Anyone who's a whiskey, I'm talking as a whiskey drinker right now, not someone who works in the industry. We're really spoiled because it's like boom time. Credible expressions. There's lots of age out there, lots of choice. There's some amazing regions blowing up that have never been really anything before, like Tasmania, Taiwan. All of this is happening. But in the 1980s, the 1990s, even the early noughties, whiskey wasn't in a great place. It was really, really, really tough times. So it's incredible to think how it's changed from when that project was announced. A lot of people were thinking, because on that project I was like 3 months in the job, and the next least experienced person was almost 20 years working, and there was still this belief of this Rose Isle distillery is quite big, and back then it was considered huge, and there was lots of critics. This monster distillery, actually it's a medium-sized distillery these days because of the way other distilleries have expanded, but there were still people who thought they're building this to close down 3 or 4 distilleries. That was the feeling back then, which now, are you crazy? Because it's building a distillery. So it was great, and it's been a great run, and it's been an incredible time for whiskey. I don't think the whiskey industry is going to make the same mistakes that it made back in the 1980s, because the belief is in the 1980s what happened is sales went down, and that's why everyone thought there was a crash. They didn't. Sales continued to go up. The problem was, this is where the camera starts to mess with me again. Problem was, sales went like this, but production, people got really bullish, and production went like that, and they just far too much whiskey. I don't think that's going to happen again, or not as severely. So right now, it's amazing to see all these distilleries. I do wonder about some of them. Some of these really small distilleries that are just sort of opening up. You're kind of like, well, why are you opening? So I'm excited, and I'm hopeful, and if they make incredible stuff, then fantastic. But maybe, as you say, I cannot keep track. I have no idea how many distilleries there are in Scotland. I used to know, but now there's no point. By the time you counted it up, you go back to the start, there's more to add on top. So it's exciting, but hopefully there's a wee bit of caution there,
Yeah, I mean, it's at the beginning of tastings when I'm talking about how many distilleries there are in Scotland. I always say, oh, it's 130, 140-ish. And I always sort of say that number, but I'm probably way off even now.
Yeah.
It's probably a bit more than that now. I don't know.
It used to be for a long time, because of the 40 years with nothing built. It was like 125 was a solid number. 125, you'd be on the green for any golfers. These days, I genuinely don't know. So that's what it used to be 125. Now there's so many building. I just don't know.
Great comment from Rob Akers here, who says GM Original is one of my all-time favorites. That complexity and depth is brilliant.
Absolutely. So it's my favorite. It's my favorite as well. Again, not to boast, but I get to drink all of our products, and I get access to like the super rare, the super old, the super different, and they're amazing. But if you find me in a bar anywhere in the world, and I'm out on out my travels, and I've got like usually the first night or the last night you get time to chill out, I'll be drinking Original. It's just so amazing. It's just so delicious that it's my favorite. It's my all-time favorite.
The one I was going to pour for myself for us having this chat was actually the original Astar. So
yeah, nice. So that also, for the same sort of reason, Glenmorangie and high quality.
Right as well. Have I got the right glass?
You have indeed. You have indeed.
Come on. I got the right glassware for it.
So Astar's one of my all-time favorites, because it really is. It's like a riff. It's like as Dr. Bill says, it's like Glenmorangie Original on steroids. Only Dr. Bill pronounces things funny, so he says steroids. But it's like a souped up, bulked up original. So I love Astar, and that was one of the things when I joined. So when I got the job at Glenmorangie after 5 interviews, a 6-month process, and all this sort of stuff, I set myself 2 little goals in my head, and I was like, "There's 2 whiskies that I want to have again." See, the angle of this camera is really confusing me. One of them was Ardbeg 17. So I wanted to relaunch Ardbeg 17. It's not going to happen, so I'm not giving you an exclusive, but Ardbeg 19 came instead, the Tri-Van. The other one that I wanted to remake was Glenmorangie Astar. So I used to chap on Dr. Bill's door pretty much every day saying we should do Astar. And he used to say, "Look, I love your passion for it and I love your idea, but we're trying to do new things. Let's not reheat cold soup," he used to say. But eventually I just got some designer casks, because that's what used to make Astar, these high quality, slow growth, air seasoned American white oak casks. It's all first fill for that reason. But I put together a batch and put it in front of him, and then eventually he was like, yeah, let's do it. So that's how we got to do the Astar 2017. So that's absolutely in my top 2, probably, if not top 5. Yeah.
There is a cool story, but this is the original Astar. I do have a bottle of the newer one, but this was actually there is a cool story that connects to this with the SMWS, with the designer casks of 125.1 to 125.10 in our coding system, which was very early on. And those designer casks that Bill presented to the panel and said, "Here, I've got something really special to show you." And speaking of that, actually, there's a few questions coming in here. I'm going to bring up this screen here, just show a bottle of Alta here, and just say it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on the on what aspects and what production you've what aspect of product creation have you had to do with some of the special releases? We see things like Alta and Spios and private editions, as well as things like the Ardbeg Day releases and Anoa. And I'm probably saying Anoa wrong. You got to say Anoa much.
It's an O.
And O. Sorry. Yeah. There you
go. We stick extra letters into everything, but it's an O.
And O. So what's your role involved in creating those releases?
Yeah, so I'm kind of involved in all of them. Just let me fix this. Yeah, so I'm kind of involved in all of them, but the private edition series and the Ardbeg days, Dr. Bill is heavily involved in all those because they're such important products. But yeah, I'm part of the team, so sometimes I make the cask selection. If not making the cask selection, when Dr. Bill's nosing, tasting, grading casks, trying to decide what gets in and what gets taken out, I'm a part of that. I'm part of the the think tank, or just the brainstorming of what can we do in the future, what new things. Also, I just sort of if I ever come across some exciting casks, if I'm ever out in the world and I find a nice, an exciting winery or a different product, then I'll buy casks and just get them sent to the distillery to start experiments. So yeah, I'm involved in all of them. Now with Alltime, that was like an experiment that began 12 years ago, you know, harvesting yeast off of the ears of corns of barley, growing them up and turning them into this sort of natural, local field yeast, you know, this wild yeast called Saccharomyces diamath. So that all happened 12 years ago. 12 years ago, I was, God, where was I? 12 years ago, I'd be at Diageo, you know, so I wasn't involved at the beginning, but I then, when I joined, I was already starting to nose and taste how the project was maturing and how it was developing. So yeah, I'm involved. I help to write the tasting notes. You know, Bill will set out the samples. We've got Gillian in the team, so Gillian McDonald who's in our team will set out the samples. Gillian, myself, and Bill will all nose taste, write our own tasting notes, and then it will all kind of get brought together and roll up into the final tasting notes for the spirit.
So on a question, talking of spirit and talking about sort of nosing and assessing and sort of going into the realm of sensory analysis, if you like. Now, I'm just putting up a very valid photo here. I'm sure you've seen this place before.
Once or twice.
Yeah, once or twice. And I just want to talk a little bit about how you sort of the challenge of actually working between arguably two very, very different distilleries. It's not like you're working on two Speyside distilleries or two Highland distilleries that are down the road from each other. You're working on one Islay distillery, and this, I mean, if you've got one Highland and one Islay, and you've got, how do you split that balance up between them? And how do you find the challenge of working with two ultimately very, very different spirits?
Yeah, so again, it's a great question, and so my time is split not quite 50-50. My time's probably spent 60% on Glenmorangie, 40% on Ardbeg, and that's just because of the size of the two distilleries, brands, whatever you want to call it. But Glenmorangie is maybe 4.5 times larger than Ardbeg for capacity, and a lot of my work is in, you know, buying wood, warehousing stuff, making it develop. But in terms of actually working on the spirits, I've heard a couple of people. I was going to say I've heard people roll their eyes. I mean, that would be impressive if you heard someone roll their eyes. But I'm sure people sometimes think this is like some marketing bullshit that I'm saying. But genuinely, one of the most advisable things that I've had from Dr. Bill and I follow is you try not to work on Ardbeg and Glenmorangie in the same day. You know, it almost is. It's almost a different mindset, and there is a physicality to that as well. You know, the Ardbeg is super strong, in your face, and quite primary flavoured. Glenmorangie is elegant and subtle and complex. So you could maybe move from Glenmorangie and do some Ardbeg very much later in the day, maybe. But the first thing that you do is you genuinely try to come in on a day to work on Glenmorangie, and then separately you try and come in on a day to work on Ardbeg. Doesn't always happen that way, you know. If someone has an Ardbeg and they say, look, this sample doesn't seem right, can you have a look at it? You don't go, oh, it's Wednesday, I've got my Glenmorangie top on, so I'm not going to do it. Of course, sometimes you look at it, but there really is almost like a mindset. There's a mindset difference between the two. Above that, there's certain understandings. So with Ardbeg, in a great way, with Ardbeg, the quality of the spirit is pretty much guaranteed, you know, because it's big and smoky, you know. If your life depends on it, you know, if the devil appears and challenges you to make whiskey for a year with no quality, and if you do that, you win all the wishes in the world. What you'd choose, if you were wise, is you'd choose to make a smoky spirit, because smoke will hide any tiny little flaws in the spirit. When you make Glenmorangie, it's way harder. You know, Glenmorangie is just it's so bright and it's so fresh, and
the flaws can hide behind smoke. Then, in that regard,
that's it. That's it.
Hide behind peak. Sorry.
That's it. And with Glenmorangie, there's nowhere to hide. There's nowhere to hide. So it has to be perfect. It has to be absolute perfect. Think of it as like a sheet of white paper for a canvas, or a sheet of black paper for a canvas. If there's a little speck on it, you're probably not going to see it in the black. That's Ardbeg. That's smoke. With Glenmorangie, just this little dot of colour. If it's a white sheet, it it jumps out. So in many ways, Glenmorangie is way harder, requires much more skill, much more focus to get the spirit perfect. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you're doing new make spirit evaluation. And then the other thing that it's just understanding these spirits. And I'm 6 years in, and I feel I've learned a lot, but there's still way more to learn. And every day is like a school day. But the other thing is sometimes you love working on Glenmorangie because you get a hold of, let's just make it up, you get a hold of Australian red wine casks, big Shiraz red wine cask or something like that. I know for a fact that if I put Glenmorangie in that, after say 3 months, 4 months, I've got an idea, a very accurate idea of where it's going to end up in 2 years' time. So I know it's going to work or it's not, and I can already start planning and start thinking about, and let's sample it again in 6 months. But I know the direction that it's heading in. With Ardbeg, it can take 6, 7, 8 years. It tends to be a full-time maturation. And just like the one that you flashed up there, the Ardbeg Black, which is noir from New Zealand, for the first 4 years, we were just like, this hasn't changed. It just takes, and then eventually it starts to twist. So sometimes you love it. You love Glenmorangie because it changes so quick, and you hate Ardbeg because it won't change. And then other times you're cursing Glenmorangie because you're kind of like slow down. You're changing too quickly, and that's when you love working on Ardbeg because you've got this time to kind of plan out and think about what's going to happen. So it's a bit of a mess. It can really play on your mind. But genuinely, the best advice I had from Dr. Bill is try and work on them in separate days. He almost, let's say, is take your head off, and put a different one on.
Yeah, right, yeah. Because I guess, as you said, like the Ardbeg spirit will just overwhelm the palate, and you'll just trying to do both in one day might be a bit sort of lost between the two.
Exactly. Yeah.
I've got to say, actually, I've got to commend Ardbeg for recently releasing the Wee Beastie, and for the actual having the courage to put a 5-year-old age statement on a modern whiskey. Especially because I think I'd like to think, and I'd love your take on this, that we're coming out of the, I guess, the hiding behind no age statement rather than pioneering it. Like spirits, like whiskeys, like I'd argue whiskeys like Signet have been no age statement for well before no age statement was so prevalent. And now we're seeing whiskeys like Wee Beastie, which proudly carry an age statement, but are so well integrated as a young whiskey. Yeah.
So there's quite a lot in there. So if I start rabbiting on too much, just cut me off. But a couple of things. So non-aged whiskey, I love. I do. I love it as a whiskey drinker, and I love it as a whiskey maker. As a whiskey drinker, I love it because some non-aged whiskies taste incredible. Non-aged whiskey allows you to try things that probably wouldn't have been done if there was, an absolute rule of all whiskey must be 18 years old. Whiskey makers would be less likely to take risks on very different casks because, all your stock is tied up. So if you get a brand new cask in, you can be a lot more adventurous if you're not limited by age. Let's just stick with this red wine cask example. You get this big red wine in from Australia. You don't know how it's going to perform. You don't know how big it's going to be. You don't know how impactful it's going to be. You don't know about the wood species so much. So if you're doing a non-aged whiskey, you can put 8-year-old whiskey in it, 9-year-old whiskey in it, 10-year-old whiskey, 11, 12, and you can monitor them and see which one works best. Or actually, you can blend all those together. So non-aged whiskies are super important. They drive innovation. They give you some freedom. It's almost like having, I always go back to cooking, but it's almost like having, you open up the spice rack and you have all these different flavors that you can add to whatever you're making. That to me is great non-aged whiskey. What I do not agree with is, let's say someone came to Glenmorangie tomorrow, a new CEO came in and said, we want to double in size next year. So, well, doubling in size is going to take 10 years because I need to make double the amount of 10-year-old because that's how old the original is. If they suddenly are going to make Glenmorangie original non-aged, that I disagree with. That is bad non-age. That's greedy. Yeah. It's just greedy. It's a money grab. It's not for quality. So if you take a product that exists already and uses like traditional, well-known casks, and you just suddenly de-age it, that to me is something that I can't agree with and I can't get behind. But if you make something that's non-aged because you're doing something experimental or you're trying to drive a different flavour, then it totally works for me. Now, Wee Beastie, for Ardbeg. The reason that's not non-aged, it's really quite important for certain Ardbegs to put an age on it. So the younger an Ardbeg is, the smokier it is. Equally and conversely, if that even makes sense. The older an Ardbeg is, the less smoky it becomes. So the Trivan, the 19-year-old Ardbeg, it's 19 years old, but it's important to say it's 19 years old so that people understand this isn't your big, in-your-face, smoky Ardbeg. So if you're looking for a big in-your-face smoke, get the 10, or now get the wee beastie, or get super, because that's like really kept the smoke in. But if you want something that's still smoky, still Isla, still unmistakably Ardbeg, but the smoke is more sort of plateaued, and it's kind of like a background, it's a secondary flavour, and you're actually going to get more of the fruitiness, more of the citrus. That's why you put the 19 years very clearly on the front of the Ardbeg. And it's for the same reason we put that massive 5 in the front of wee beastie. It just, 5 years means it's half the age. It means it's half the time for the smoke to escape out of the cask during maturation. So it just makes it like a bigger, raw, more intense whiskey. And like you say, I mean, it's been received unbelievably well. And we just love showing off how you can actually change the smoke in Ardbeg through maturation, as opposed to just constantly saying more phenols on the malt.
Yeah, rather than just relying on a ppm number or whatnot.
Yeah.
On the topic, there's quite a few questions coming in on the topic of no age statement. I'm just going to jump forward a few questions where Robert asks, on the other side of no age statement, the finish range, e.g. Quinta Ruban, etc., recently went from 12 to 14 years old. What was the driver for the change there?
Yeah, so very easy. I'd love to say I just suddenly woke up one day and said to Bill, let's go to 14, or Bill came in and said, we're going to 14. We were over the moon happy with the 12. Believe me, we didn't want to necessarily change, but it was a consistent request from Glenmorangie fans globally. So every time me and Bill went out into the markets, people were saying there's a 10-year-old, the original. There's La Santa, Quinta, and Nectar d'Or are all 12-year-olds, and then the next age that we can taste Glenmorangie at is 18. So they were kind of saying, what happens in the middle? And we were explaining, like, well, 10 to 12 is kind of like a sweet spot for whiskey. 18 is another sort of sweet spot for whiskey. You get this good sort of balance of wood to spirit character, wood character, character and balance. But it kept happening. People kept saying, we'd love to see something in the middle. So that's where we started thinking about, can we make one of the whiskies a little older without losing the balance, without losing the complexity? So for the La Santa, the sherry, that was impossible. More time in the sherry was just going to drown the whiskey, take away that house style, take away the distillery character. And if you do that, then forget it. What's the point? But Quinta, we had some stock that had, so don't forget, when it's a 12-year-old, that means it has 12-year-old, but it can have 13, 14, 15-year-old whiskey in it. And we had some 14-year-old casks. So we had some 10-year-old in bourbon 4 in port. We had some 12-year-old in bourbon 2 in port. And we just started to play with it. And we realised, do you know what? This tastes every bit as good as the 12, if not even better. So then it was just a pure response to customers, just consumers asking for something different. So we moved 14 years, and then something that got like massive kudos out in the whiskey world is we kept the price the same. So made it older, kept the price the same. And it's just absolutely rocketing at the moment. Like, people are loving it. It's also in green and white packaging, and as a Glasgow Celtic football fan, I'm that. But that was not me. I had nothing to do with it.
Sure. Guiding hand in the marketing team right there.
Yeah.
There's also some cool questions coming through. I just want to jump on here. James Caden asks, how do you reset your palate between tasting samples, even in a day? And what do you do on a day that you feel like your palate is a bit off? That's a really good question.
It's a great question. So before you even think about resetting your palate, one of the big things that I've learned in the 6 years, I learned this early on, is just don't do too much, So don't get me wrong, like, I will put up on Instagram every so often pictures of like all of these sort of samples laid out, and loads and loads and loads of samples. So if you ever see me looking at, say, like 100 samples, What that is it's like a quick check. It's just a quick scan, nose, 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 nose. And you're trying to see if anything's, you know, sour or got an off note, and you're trying to see if anything jumps out as outstanding. So that'd be a quick pass. But once you're getting closer to like making a brand new whiskey, or you're approving the next batch of something before it goes out into the world, I mean, that's really, really important. What you tend to do is just try and have 2 or 3 things that you look at in a day. Don't overload, don't rush, don't do too much. So that's before resetting. Now, in terms of resetting your palate, I know there's some people who knows coffee beans. There's some people who knows very COVID friendly, but you know, you knows your elbow, and that helps. See, to be honest, the thing that works for me is I drink gallons of water. I just drink, take a glass of water, go outside, leave the lab, take a walk, and that resets my palate as good as anything else. You know, it's just take a break, don't rush, drink lots of water. Works a treat for me. On days where your palate is a bit off, it happens. You can probably hear I'm a little bit blocked up right now. It's just, you know, I think it's a bit of hay fever or something like that. So when you're blocked up, it's just don't do it. Don't do it. I would be cautious, nervous. I'm being diplomatic. I'd run a mile if I met a whiskey maker who said, I'm the only person who noses and tastes the whiskey at my company. If I heard that, I would be going, right, I'm not going to spend my money on your product, then that sounds risky. The other thing is you always have a panel. You know this. I mean, SMWS, famous for incredible nosing panels. You have to have a panel. Different people have different palates. I'm super sensitive to coconut. Old tone, I can pick it up. I'm scared of coconuts, frankly. Coconuts for me.
You don't like the flavor compound like coconut? You don't like it all?
It's not I don't like it. So I like it in small amounts, but a small amount to you of being almost imperceptible to me is like someone's put 17 coconuts in this curry. You know, I'm just super sensitive to it. My wife is banned from any kind of coconut-based beauty products because I just walk in and I'm like, oh my God, it stinks of coconut in here. So I'm super sensitive to that. So that's really useful. But if I was the only person on the nosing panel, I might say, oh, this one's too okay, this one's too okay, this one's too okay. But then there's other people on a panel who are super sensitive to, say, grassy notes like acetaldehyde and things like that.
Or sulfur in some.
Yeah. So it's important to have a panel. It's important to have a panel so that there's a mix of people and you have a balanced view of what's good or bad. And then also the other good thing about having a panel is that if I have a cold or my palate's just a bit crap one day, you know, there's still 7 to 10 other people looking at that whiskey. So it's not like it holds up production. But usually, you know, the next day you'll be fine or something like that. And we also tend to have about, even on a rush, even if something broke down or there was an issue or something got pulled forward, you're still looking at about a week to 10 days that we have to look at samples, nose them and approve them. You know, you're never going to make a whiskey batch and bottle it the next day. That's just planning for failure, you know?
Yeah. Right. Just in terms of planning, actually, just want to get onto that topic before we take our last few questions for the hour.
Sure.
Just on the topic of planning, you mentioned before, like quite early on, about planning for volumes of spirit and obviously making models of maintaining a release and how much you lay down. I can understand that I have a feeling, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that'd be a fair bit easier to do for Glenmorangie than it would be for Ardbeg, especially because Ardbeg, A, seems like it has a bit more of a cult-like following amongst sort of whiskey fanatics, and B, is sort of like the baby brother of the Isla distilleries in terms of output. So how do you manage it, especially for a distillery like Ardbeg, where the volume is obviously it's 2.4 million litres last time I looked, or something like that in terms of output.
It will be eventually. It's just over 1 million, 1.3 million at the moment.
Oh, sorry. Right, 1.3, even way smaller than I thought.
Yes, tiny.
So even if you compare that on Isla to something like a Kalila, or if you compare that on Isla to, or if you compare even to, you know, your Glenlivets or McCarrons of the world, where output is massive.
Yeah, so Ardbeg is just over 1 million. Kalila is 6.5 million. Macallan is 18 million. And Glenlivet, once it expands, it's not expanded yet, but once it expands, it's planning to be 33 million dollars. So
essentially 33 Ardbeg distilleries in size.
Yeah, potentially. And then if you look at a grain distillery, so grain whiskey, important part of a blend, it's a continuous process. There's a grain whiskey distillery in Fife, and it can make double Ardbeg's production in 1 week. So there's different ones. But two things about that. Don't just assume that bigger equals worse quality. There's a lot of people.
No.
So if it's bigger in size, it means the quality is not as good. It's a batch process, so you can have very big distilleries where the quality is phenomenal. I'm a big Glenlivet fan. You can have tiny distilleries where the quality is crap. Don't just, and I won't mention who they are, but you all know who they are.
We all know.
You all know. We know. But it's actually the same challenge for both distilleries. It's the same challenge. It's not easy. What you want to do is you want to have a distillery. So first and foremost, quality is paramount. So you cannot force the distillery to make more than it's capable of making. You might be able to change the process a little to make it more sustainable, and that's super important. But the quality is king. After obviously non-negotiably keeping all of our people safe. Of course, that's the most important thing. But in terms of the actual product, quality rules, quality beats everything else. But after that, what you try to do is you're trying to make enough spirit so that you can grow. We are a business, and we do have fans all around the world. And I think what would piss fans off is if they go to get a bottle of Ardbeg 10 and there isn't any, and they're told they'll come back, in 2 months' time, then they'll make another batch. So what you try to do is you try to make enough spirit each year so that you can grow and you can keep everyone getting their hands on the bottle they want. You want to make a little bit more than you need, because if you make a little bit more than you need, that's when you get the chance to do something exciting. So you get to make like a cool non-age product, or you get to put some stuff away and let it age longer, and you make a 19-year-old product or a 25-year-old product. What you don't want to do is not make enough. You don't make enough, then you're going to have to restrict supply. Price will probably go up. Less people get to try your product. And that's been a problem for Ardbeg, because the 1980s, it closed, so we had no stock. So that's what and then the other thing you don't want to do is just like put down the accelerator and just make as much as you possibly can every single year and expand. Because if you have far too much, that again goes back to the days of overproduction, where you just can't sell it all, and you've got a lot of stock tied up, not really doing anything. So there's this kind of complex.
Do you see a problem with wood supply in that as well, in that equation?
Eventually it could be, but for us, we're two single malt whiskey distilleries. We don't have a blend. We're not like some of the big places. Eventually it'd be a problem, but for us, not right now. Really, what you just do is you try to
rest in peace.
you just try to make enough. You try to make enough, but not too much. Sure. And then you're kind of trying to predict the future. Who would have known 20 years ago where single malt would be right now? So 20 years ago, knowing what we know now, 20 years ago we should have expanded Ardbeg and made triple the amount, because right now demand is at least 3 times supply. But even with that knowledge, even if you had a time machine, would you do it? I don't know. I think there's something important about just slowly and steadily and carefully trying to grow in just a sustainable, high quality way. The good thing about it is there's no right answer. So myself, a guy called Marcus in the company, and David, Marcus and David try and predict the future. And you can't ever be right. There's no correct answer, which is also good because you can never be wrong. So if I can never be wrong, then they can't fire me. But you just try and lay down a bit more, but just don't get cocky, don't get bullish, don't get stupid. Don't insist that we're going to go 20% every year, so let's like hammer out the spirit. It's just slowly and steadily is the best way.
We just assumed you had an upgraded LVMH crystal ball every year.
The best quality. It'll be a diamond ball, I guess.
It'll be a diamond ball, wouldn't it? Crystals for plebs. What are you worried about?
Yeah, exactly. Come on. No, man, that's luxury.
There's a couple of quick fire ones here. Scott Mansfield, our state manager up in Queensland for the SMWS, asks, do you ever access historic stocks to find inspiration? So often hear about those 1970s Ardbegs.
Yeah, so I don't know about for inspiration. Inspiration comes from like everywhere. It's I certainly access people who worked at the distillery in the 70s and people who would show up at the distillery in the 1980s when it was closed to do maintenance to get a lot of inspiration. This is where people wish that I go to hell, but I do get to taste all of our stock, which includes a handful of casks from the 1970s. And yeah, it's like a magical thing, you know. It's just, you're just tasting history, and it's incredible, and I'm very lucky to be able to get to do it. And because they're so old, you know, we're now looking at stuff that's, you know, coming up 50 years old, and the smoke is still there, but it really has, it's almost like the smoke almost appears after you've drunk the whiskey, and it's like the dryness that remains on the palate, and it's just this ethereal, different experience. So it's amazing. But yeah, so in terms of for inspiration, I find them inspiring when I drink them, but I think I get more of my inspiration from the people who were there at that time, who I get to speak to. I get my inspiration from the history of the distillery in general, and then I also get my inspiration just from what's going on in the world right now. But, you know, so we still have stock from the 70s, not a lot, and almost no stock from the 1980s. So yeah, it's becoming more and more precious all the time. It's a bit of a crap answer, I'm sorry, but... No,
it's a good answer. That's fine. And we'll just Miranda from Whiskey and Helmet says whiskey forecasting must be the most terrifying job.
So don't forget it is, because you can't possibly get it right, but put a positive spin on that. I mean, you can't ever get it wrong. That's the key.
You can't ever get it wrong, so that's fine. We'll leave it there for now. I really appreciate the chat. It's been great, Brendan, having you on. Seriously fantastic. So, and I don't want to keep you too long. I said we'd cap it near 45 minutes, and we've gone just a little bit over. So I really appreciate you being on today. So thank you so much from myself and all society members in Australia, and anyone who's across the world. We often get some international members, such as Mark Westmoreland from Wolfburn Distillery, who's been watching the whole time. Thanks, Mark, for tuning in. And
nice.
Always a pleasure. So like I said, thank you again, Brendan.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. You know, I am a SMWS member here in Scotland. I love you guys. I love what you do. And yeah, I hope to be... I was in Australia in February, just before this all went insane. And I hope that I'm back next year, and let's get a dram.
Yeah, I'd love to. Whether that dram be in Scotland or that dram be in Sydney, it's my shout.
Let's do both. Let's do both.
Don't go anywhere, Brendan. Everyone... please leave your comments for Brendan in the comment stream. I'll send them to him afterwards as well. And of course, thank you last time again. Thank you so much for taking your breakfast to chat with our members this morning, and in your special Glenmorangie mug. And we'll catch up again. We'd love to have you on again actually sometime. But in the meantime, keep an eye out for the lives coming up for the rest of the week. Of course, the next one will be our Friday night live, which will be tomorrow night. So thank you, everyone, so much. Brendan, don't go anywhere. I'll catch you all again soon. Cheers. Thanks, people.